Hello, my name's Ed Poole and I'm a member of the Green Party. We have our autumn conference coming up and I'm speaking to members who proposed policies to be discussed at conference. Today I'm talking to Sheridan Kates about Fiscal Referees policy. Hi Sheridan.
Hi, Ed. It's really great to be here.
This policy was put together by the Economic Policy Working Group. Can you tell us a bit about who that is?
Absolutely. So the Economic Policy Working Group, to our knowledge, this is one of, if not the biggest and most active policy working group. We're a mix of Green Party members with an interest in economics. And so to be clear, anyone can join. You don't have to have qualifications in economics. There's no gatekeeping here. But we do have numerous members with academic qualifications, many with very relevant experience, such as in the banking sector, accountancy, working for different think tanks and such. We have about 84 members with a Discord channel that we use to try and talk to each other, more like fluidly. We have an email circulation list of over 200. And so there tends to be like a smaller core that like actually contributes to the actual writing of policy. We're all volunteers, but there's a wider group which asks questions, challenges, ultimately signs it all off as a policy working group endorsed motion. And we had a really big increase in interest following the last conference, which was in October 2025, obviously with a big membership surge as well. Our monthly meetings, we get about 30 people, as many as 30 people, might fluctuate depending on what stage we're at. But it's been a really active group, and we've been really focused on changes for sort of the last 5 years in this iteration.
What research and data has informed your approach to this policy?
I think it's really important to start off by saying economics presents itself as some kind of natural science, where there's this idea that things work in a way that's controlled by models and it's all very logical. But there really are multiple schools of thought in economics. We don't go with traditional views because that's very much what's got us into the current position where, we have a poly crisis and everyone's really struggling. So at the core of what we are proposing is sort of ecological economics, one of these schools of thought. So that really kind of goes into Kate Raworth's donut economics. Jason Hickel is also a really big proponent of this. It's got a long tradition where basically rather than thinking of the economy as something that can just be purely managed with markets, we need to be thinking about like what is the overall size of the economy and are we actually meeting everyone's needs within that? We also think a lot about inequality as we do across the whole of the Green Party. There's such like Texas spirit level. There's the John and Jamie Galbraith into this a lot. Gabrielle Zuckman thinking about wealth taxes. We looked at Mariana Mazzucato and for the influences in terms of like what the state should be doing in terms of making big bets. There's a whole sort of area of institutional economics where people are thinking about, well, there isn't just like a natural way that things happen. Like, there's a history of how, we got to the point where we have institutions that operate in the way they did and how did that happen and how could we possibly change that in the future? There are really important texts from Isabella Weber on inflation and how to think about that. We also think about monetary operations a lot to make sure that, we are thinking about the power of the government and what is possible with public money. So New Economics Foundation is really critical in there, along with Positive Money, Josh Ryan Collins at the University College London. And then there's something really important here as well to think about in terms of like global exploitation. It doesn't really reflect in this part of the policy yet because it's just a piece. There's just a piece of the chapter that we're replacing. But global exploitation and unequal exchange. So like how the global South is so critical to our capitalist system right now, and how we need to stop that. We really need to ensure that they can de-link, that they can actually build their economies in the way that they want to, and not just to serve the global North. So I think that's a big mix of all of the areas that have influenced what we're doing.
Yeah, there we go. We love it.
Where are we? Right. This policy is about replacing the government's fiscal rules. Can you explain a little bit about what they are at the moment?
I guess I'll just start as well by just framing it because as Greens we talk about a lot about the needs for economic system change. We call out GDP growth as a flawed measure, one that should be replaced with a dashboard of indicators that are about well-being, and making sure that we're not going beyond the safe limits of the planet. That's already policy. The basis of this motion is to sort of produce a credible and evidence platform on which we can actually move to a system like that. And right now the fiscal rules are something that is really holding us back in terms of how we think about the role that the government and public money can play in all of that. So fiscal rules in themselves only started in the 90s, and they've changed many times over the years. I think there's been 10 different iterations since the 90s. They've been suspended at the times of like financial shock, so like during COVID. The current fiscal rules kind of have three main areas. There's a stability rule where we are supposed to only spend on sort of day-to-day services by whatever we pull in taxes. So basically need to make sure that you are either meeting that as a balanced budget or you're spending less than is coming in taxes. So that's the first sort of stability rule. The second one is the investment rule. So that's around the overall financial debt, and that's supposed to fall as a share of GDP by 2029 or 2029 to 2030. So that the idea is that that was supposed to go down overall. And then there's a third sort of like welfare spending rule, which is around like certain parts of the welfare system are supposed to stay below a certain cap, which I think has been raised a little bit in recent years. But there's three areas. And so much of this is like predicated on the idea of like government spending being like a household income, right? We've maxed out the credit card. We can't spend more than we already have as a share of the economy. And so what we'd actually have to do is grow the economy if we want to spend more. And there's all kinds of reasons why that's problematic. And there's also just no evidence that our current level of debt is too high. So currently it's about 95% debt to GDP ratio. There've been some changes recently where Rachel Reeves has looked at the financial assets that we have kind of on the other side of the ledger. So she's pulled that down to a number that's 85%. So, that's just kind of an accounting change. But the basis of austerity back in 2010, quoted by George Osborne, was a report by economists Reinhardt and Rogoff, which said that if government debt went above 90%, then that would cause growth to decline. It would be catastrophic for growth. And in the current capitalist system, we really need growth, right? But that was based on a spreadsheet error. I was never redacted. Like there was a PhD student in I think it was Massachusetts who discovered like a few years later they'd actually forgotten to include all of the countries from their Excel spreadsheet in the calculations that they did. And when they did pull that in, I think they'd seen something like a decline of like some small percentage. It went up to like plus 2% or something when all the countries have gone in. So even these the foundations for like why we think that this level of debt is too high have just been completely debunked. There's no reason to think that we're at too high of a level of debt right now. Japan has had around 250% debt to GDP ratio for many, many years. We really need to stop acting like this is some boogeyman that we can't go above.
I think I read, I think Thomas Piketty, it might have been, there was a lot of, he looked at basically how countries are pretty much always have a deficit. I think the only time
Yeah.
I read somewhere, I think one of the only times a major economy in the West came out of deficit was the Clinton administration, and they instantly went into recession because of,
Exactly. That is such a fascinating time actually, because they were running a surplus, there was a deficit. Well, there's a dearth, let's say, let's not use the term deficit, a dearth of government bonds for sale. So like these government bonds are actually a really highly coveted financial asset by large parts of the financial industry. And it's actually, there's a lot of thinking that says that that's the reason that mortgage-backed securities were actually created, because they were like, okay, we need another really safe asset. Oh, look, nothing safer than houses. So let's create this mortgage-backed securities like financial asset. And so they started plowing money into that because they weren't getting the securities that they needed from government. And look what happened after that, right? I think like what that really says is when you go when you aim for these surpluses that are not necessarily a natural part of your economy, you can cause really huge problems elsewhere in the economy. One other thing I'll just flag there is that there are major economies that operate under surplus. So Norway is an example, for example, of one of those. They have massive exports. And that's how you kind of like get around that, because the reason that you need this deficit, you need to be putting government money into the economy, it's because people want to save, right? Hopefully you have obviously it's really hard for people to save at the moment, but ideally you'd have a little bit of money in your bank account, right? And if the government taxed out everything that it spent into the economy, then where would that money come from? We can talk about bank lending, but like that bank lending doesn't actually produce money in a stable way that like government spending does. If you are exporting a lot, then you can get money from other countries, right? And it's almost like, you're getting it from their governments in a certain way. But if you are a net importer, as we are, it's just the way our economy is at the moment, you really need that government spending to happen. And aiming for a surplus can actually be incredibly dangerous.
So what does the fiscal referees policy propose to replace these fiscal rules with?
So I think at its basis, we really want to highlight the fact that um, this economic system change that we're aiming for is going to require, a really different way of thinking about how we prioritize the economy, right? Right now we're really like looking to the market to produce so many things that we can't live without, right? And that's really causing like a lot of exploitation and causing things like the housing crisis. Just in terms of like numbers, there's been reports out there. The Centre for Progressive Policy, which I think may have changed its name since, but a few years ago, said we would need 142 billion pounds extra per year just to keep services at the level they were in 2023. And we know it was already really bad then, right? We'd had like hundreds of thousands of excess deaths because of austerity. Obviously, COVID, we were absolutely not prepared, and the way in which that was dealt with, it really enriched the ultra wealthy and didn't actually help us deal with the crisis that very well at all in terms of even like, developed nations. And so we're really trying to emphasize the fact that we are, if it's 142 billion just for that, I mean, wealth taxes, for example, which are super important, I do think we need to really have those wealth taxes, but they're only going to raise even the entire suite, the ones where you don't just count the 1 to 2% wealth tax, but also things like equalizing capital gains with income tax, all that kind of thing. We are looking at like 50 to 70 billion a year for that entire suite of wealth taxes. So that's peanuts compared to like what we need overall, right? And we haven't even talked about like all that's needed to mitigate the climate crisis, or to reverse the absolute hemorrhaging of social housing from our economy. There's big amounts of money that need to be found from somewhere. So we really need to be thinking about public money and how to use it. So the kind of like big proposal that we have here is, instead of having this very rigid fiscal rules approach where you can't go above a certain number, we'd have this idea called fiscal referees. And so this idea came from the New Economics Foundation, who have endorsed this motion as well, which was great. And the idea is that rather than just like, looking at this number that you can't go above, you need to be thinking about what it is you're actually trying to do as a government. So what are your goals, right? So let's say that, we're obviously like basing our kind of thinking around like donut economics. So we want to make sure that no one can go below a floor. Everyone's basic needs are met. But we don't go above a certain level either, because, right now, like we are massively exceeding so many of the planetary boundaries, things like ocean pollution and carbon emissions. So you basically need to look at what you need to do to get within those goals. And so that might actually require spending at least a certain amount. So for example, like, if you want to make sure that everyone has access to a good job, right, you can make sure that like you spend to create good jobs in the public sector, that you ensure that you're investing in areas that will like strategically improve our ability to be more resilient to things like the climate crisis. So agroecology, that kind of thing. But the fiscal referee's job would be to look at a range of indicators. So things like, what resources do we have available to us? Like what land is there available? What people do we have available? How can we train them up in different skills? And then based on that, say, okay, this is the range of spending that you should target. And I think that is just so compelling because A, it's also like it's a guide, but B, it's based on real resources. It's like saying, okay, we know that like these things are available in our economy, and we as so the NEF paper calls this out as a sort of sovereign government. Most of our debt is in our own currency, so we do not need to worry about paying in other currencies where we don't control the interest rate, the exchange rate, that kind of thing. We have flexibility to create that money and use it in places that could really enhance our economy. So as part of that as well, like there's kind of like satellite things. So, we obviously, this would be a huge change, right? And so people worry about how that might affect the overall economy. So we have a few things to sort of prop that up as well. So thinking about like, how we issue government debt. So right now we do it via an auction system. We think about going to a tap system, which is how things used to work, but would mean that we have a lot more control over the interest rate that we pay on debt. And then making sure that we have much stronger controls over credit, because we are not the only ones putting money into the economy as the government. Banks also have the ability to get money out there. And so we really need to make sure that that is not being done in areas that can cause us to go over planetary boundaries. So no fossil fuel lending, no human rights abuse lending, all those kinds of areas. And then providing a public bank. So basically making sure that, the existing commercial banks out there, they can still lend money, but if they screw up and if a bank fails, then we have a public option for people to come back to. And so there's that kind of sense of security that, we can still let banks sort of like do their thing in the economy, but under much stronger guardrails and overall kind of putting the focus more towards public money.
One of the things I don't know if this is quite what you're talking about, but one of the things that always struck me as a very counterproductive way to run an economy is we pay billions in housing benefit at the minute, for example. But councils aren't allowed to borrow money to buy houses to provide council houses. So we're just
Absolutely.
billions goes into private landlords' pockets, but
Yeah,
the government's not allowed to invest in housing because we're supposed to be meeting
absolutely.
this arbitrary target. When as individuals we borrow to buy a house because it's cheaper than paying rent, and then we've got a long-term asset, but the government is not allowing itself the same logic.
Yeah, but before Thatcher, I forget the exact stats, but I think like I mean, we were spending like on public housing, but the vast majority of it was actually on building public housing. And now we're spending much more. And like the percentage has flipped. It's all spent on housing benefit. And it's just like, it's shocking. It's basically just like a money transfer straight into the pockets of private landlords. So yeah, this would absolutely be trying to move towards an approach where we think much more strategically and long term about where we're spending.
You mentioned about money creation. Isn't the amount of money we have in the economy, isn't the amount of money the government has constrained by the amount of money it's getting in tax receipts?
So it is not. It never has been. I think we can kind of see that with our own eyes. So, like in some ways, we kind of like we know deep down that that's not really how it works. Like right after COVID, like obviously, like money was found to address that. And then whenever the government wants to bail out a bank or spend money on war, there's always money for that. Um, there are academic papers on this for anyone who's interested. There's a paper called The Self-Financing State, which explains exactly how this all works. This paper came out of UCL. I think the thing to be really clear on is, this is only something that you can do if you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty. And that's what the NEF paper, the New Economics Foundation paper, calls out. When you have debt that's issued that's mostly in your own currency, then you control the interest. That you are able to pay the interest on it. In fact, actually, in the UK, we'd actually have to change our laws to not pay the interest on bonds. Like it's actually codified in our laws. And obviously, Parliament is sovereign, so it can do anything. But it would literally have to change the laws to stop interest from being paid. So when you see people freaking out about like IMF loans and like how the UK is going to need a bailout from the IMF, that's just utter nonsense. And so I think the key thing here is like, if you look at like UK government spending since records began, we've always spent more than we get back in tax. You touched on this before. We've always been in deficit. And so yeah, I think it's just like it's critical to realize that taxes are not the only and in fact, I mean, if we want to get into the details, like all the money that's spent by the government is new money. It's just that it's then offset by whatever comes in tax in terms of how much we then have to issue in bonds at the end of the day.
Can you tell us a little bit about how banks create money?
I think this is actually a really interesting area because I think a lot of people assume that like when you put your money in a bank, then that's what they're lending out when someone comes to like get a mortgage or something, or maybe they've heard of something called like fractional reserve lending, like a money multiplier, where maybe if you've got £1 you can then lend out £10 on top of that. This is actually not how it works at all. So banks actually just create money out of thin air. So for like a reference here, there's a 2014 paper from the Bank of England where they say exactly this. So when you or I go into a bank and say, I want a loan, let's say it's for a house or something like that, they're essentially, when they give you that money, they're just everything kind of like runs on a balance sheet, but there's on their asset side, they've given you a loan. So let's say £100,000. The bank has a loan of £100,000, and then it has this liability of £100,000 that they're giving out to you. So you now have to pay that money back, and when you pay that money back, you're actually canceling money out of the economy. So like when you give that money back to the bank, it got created out of thin air, and it's getting disappeared out of thin air as you pay it back. The only kind of like net addition to the economy is the interest, and that interest, like where you have to find that from somewhere, and then that goes to the bank as its earnings. So that is the one thing that still exists after you pay off your loan. And I think that the fact that this happens is so crucial to understand, because people like wring their hands so much about government debt and public money creation, when actually banks create a lot more money. And that's actually when you start to get into these sort of like financial crisis issues, because people are trying to, they have to pay off that money, right? Whereas government money that's spent into the economy, that doesn't have to be paid back unless you have a tax liability, right? So that can sit in your savings account and be more stable. So I think that's just a really important difference here to understand between bank lending and public government spending.
So if banks are creating a lot, obviously the government creates a lot of money. If banks are creating a lot of money through lending, how do we control inflation?
Yeah, and to be clear, inflation is a really complicated issue. Like, so it's not just about the quantity of money that's in the economy, right? Like, I want to be super clear about that. It's all about where the money goes, right? So, like the way in which you control inflation. I mean, we can step back to how inflation is created, right? It is addressed right now. Um, the Bank of England has one tool, it's interest rates. So if inflation's going up, they say, okay, they've got their monetary policy committee and they meet and they say, okay, do we need to raise the interest rates? Well, the thing that this doesn't take into account is there's multiple different kinds of inflation. So the only kind that works on is something called demand pull inflation, where basically it's the kind of classic, like they think there's too much money in the economy chasing too few goods and services. They're trying to like cool it down. And the way that this interest rate rise actually works, it's very cruel. Essentially, the idea is that if businesses find it harder to borrow money, there will be fewer jobs created out there. There's like less like confidence on the part of the businesses that they can, actually get returns from this money they're borrowing, and fewer jobs happen. So you get more unemployment. There's this belief that like under this inflation situation, it's being caused by a wage price spiral. So, prices go up, workers demand more money, prices go up again to cover the cost of their wages, et cetera, et cetera. And so these inflation rates going up will then kill that. The problem is there's multiple kinds of inflation, and we're actually seeing a lot more of the other kind, which is called cost push inflation. So what happens there is you get things like the climate crisis causing real shortages in the real world, right? Where like droughts cause crops to fail, or war causes oil prices to spike, and energy, like oil prices, are what they call sort of systemically significant. This comes from Isabella Weber's work. Systemically significant prices that kind of flow through the whole economy, because you're like using potentially like fossil fuels to drive goods around everywhere. Like there's just fertilizers are a fossil fuel based input, and so these costs are going into the prices of everything. And so putting the interest rates up to try and like curb demand is so cruel in some areas, because you can't just not eat anymore. You can't just not like heat your home, right? And so like that's why it's so ridiculous that we're only using interest rates to target inflation. So a big part of this policy as well is around sort of reforming the mandate of the Bank of England and sort of saying, okay, well, it's not just on the Bank of England to address inflation. It's a whole of government issue. So, with things like the cost push inflation, what we could be doing is price controls, right? We did this to some degree with the energy price guarantee, where, the cost of energy wouldn't go above a certain amount. That was a price cap. We could look at buffer stocks. So a buffer stock is where, like, let's say, we're worried about like the harvests of wheat in the future. We can set up big grain silos where we have a lot of wheat, and therefore, like, if we store that for a while, then we can draw down from those supplies of those stocks if the cost of wheat is like really expensive, to just try and give people a bit of a helping hand. We can do strategic taxation. And so I'm not talking about general taxation here, where like, we're going back to the idea that we're just generally taking money out of the economy. But let's say if you tax rental incomes on private landlords, right, you're going to make private renting less attractive. And so you're going to make those private landlords more likely to sell up. And then you can buy those houses and pull them back into social housing. And like, obviously, more social housing will mean less. The rents will go down overall. Pairing that with rent controls, that will reduce inflation on the housing sector. So there are many different things you can do, but like all of those things I've just mentioned are not within the remit of the Bank of England. And so that is why we need to be addressing inflation as a whole of the economy approach.
One of the things that always struck me as a bit odd about sort of economic management in general is, for example, if they're trying to cut NHS costs or education costs or defense costs, any of these things, one of the ways you could do that is just cut the price of electricity or cut the rent caps or any of these things that how much the NHS spend on electricity, how much they spend on rent, how much they spend on all of these things that we're just allowing to be massively expensive when we could control the prices of. And the
100%.
government's going, we need to reduce, £1 billion off the NHS budget, but we're not going to stop their electricity bill going up by £2 billion. It seems really
Yeah,
bizarre.
you're absolutely on the money there. I think was it Denby that like, the beautiful old pottery, oh well, that pottery company that's been like operating for like years and years. I think they had to shut down because of energy prices, right? Like, and we've lost like one of our amazing like pottery manufacturers, and it's because they can't like actually be profitable anymore with the prices of energy. And like obviously when we're losing so many high street businesses and such because it's really hard to run a business on the high street with the cost of energy as well. You're absolutely right.
How would this policy manage the exchange rate?
So I would say we wouldn't be actively managing the exchange rate. We have a floating exchange rate for a reason. Um, and to be clear, I think to people are really like, often like saying, okay, we can't do this because like the markets will freak out and like the exchange, like there'll be a run on the pound and the pound will drop. I think firstly, that's not necessarily a given. If we're talking about investing in areas that like actually lead to people having more money to spend on like, the nice things in life, like there may actually be investment opportunities for people to come in. So for number one, I don't necessarily buy that. But, if it did happen, we just have to stay firm. Like we actually have a very robust economy. I mean, there are areas in which it's very deficient, but we have like almost £1 billion of exports, like 946 billion pounds a year of exports. And they're basically like a falling exchange rate would make our exports more competitive. So at some point it's going to find a level at which it's going to stabilize. There is a risk for currencies where there's not a lot of demand. So that kind of goes back to this like whole, we're in the global north position and we do need to talk about like, how this affects like global south countries. But pound is around the fourth most traded currency in the world. So, there's going to be demand for our currency still, even if we like, do like start like shifting the economy in a way that starts to move us out of a very strict capitalist framing. People worry about shifts in foreign exchange then having an impact on inflation, like imported inflation. Um, I will say that's not necessarily as connected, especially in a complex economy as ours. Like we can share this actually maybe in, I don't know if you have show notes or something, but like if you plot a graph of like the exchange rate, say with the dollar against inflation, there's no strict correlation. Like, for example, like after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, there was a massive drop against the dollar, but we didn't have inflation during that period. And there are other periods where that happens too. And you do see it a bit after Brexit. Like there was a 30% drop after against the dollar, and there was a 2% rise in inflation. I think like having other methods of targeting inflation in really critical parts of the economy will be crucial in all of this, but we shouldn't act like, this is going to be an absolute disaster due to exchange rates.
James Meadway might say something about fertilizer to that point, and how much fertilizer we import. Is that something that you're worried about?
Yeah, I mean, like as I said, like there's obviously the fact that like there may not necessarily be a depreciation in the currency, but if there is, like I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying before. Like we really need to strengthen certain parts of our economy to not require things like these fossil fuel imports, right? Agroecology is an area where we absolutely need to be investing. So food and energy sovereignty is something really important to be focusing on. But it's similar to like the energy price guarantee, right? Like, we that obviously was, related to oil prices. We chose to put a price control on it. That is something that we can temporarily price control, like while we are trying to move towards a more stable economy. There may be impacts across the economy, but we can target them and not necessarily assume that it's going to be the disaster that might be claimed.
So
Mm.
if we're um, bringing in these kind of radical changes to the economy and saying we're going to do things very differently from how they've been done, probably for my whole lifetime since the 70s. Are we not going to see a kind of Liz Truss thing where everyone just panics and pulls their money out of the economy, and we have this whole kind of disastrous situation we had with the Conservative government at the time?
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on this. I'm sure it's going to come up for everyone. I think this wasn't really something that was talked about much until that 2022 mini budget. Of course, like when people say this, they're talking about the bond vigilantes, right? And so there's, the idea is they'll stop trusting the government, start actively selling the bonds, and the prices drop and the yields go up. I don't know for the benefit of the viewers, like why did the yields go up, right? So like, I think one thing is really clear, what I want to make clear actually is that these bonds that are out there, their interest rates are fixed for the entire life of the bond. So like the government is actually not paying anything different on all of those bonds that were out there when the Liz Truss affair happened. What happens actually is like, the person who's holding the bond is trying to get rid of it, right? So let's say it's £1,000 bond. They say, okay, I'll sell it to you for £900. And so it means that when you buy that, when it matures, like say at the end of 10 years, you're going to get £100 back more than you paid, right? It was £1,000 bond. You paid 900, you get 1,000 plus all the interest that you got since got the bond from the investor. So that yield, the overall amount that you got back as a percentage of that, that's what's higher, right? It's not that the interest rate changed on it. And the only reason that has any effect over our economy right now is because new government debt sales are currently kind of pegged to what the existing debt out there is being like sold at, right? So we use this thing called an auction system for when we put our bonds out there. And this is actually one of the really key parts of our motion, the TAP system. So up until the 1980s, sort of between 1940 and 1980, we used to sell government debt in a very different way. It's called the TAP system. So instead of what happens right now, where the government decides, okay, we want to raise a certain amount of money, we're going to do that by selling 30-year bonds or 10-year bonds. We are going to sell them at this particular interest rate. And the way that it then goes out to investors is via auction. So if like the investors say, okay, I don't think your interest rate is high enough, they're going to do what I just said, right? They're going to bid down how much they'll pay for those bonds. And so what that means is overall, they're going to get a higher yield. They're going to get the yield that they wanted for the bonds that they just bought. The TAP system stops them from doing that. So the way that the TAP system works is bonds at a range of tenors, so basically like 3 months to let's say 30 years, are put out on the market, right? So you can basically buy as many of these bonds as you want at these different lengths of time. But the government says, okay, this is the interest rate you're going to get on it. Take it or leave it. And so basically what that says is the market can decide, okay, what kinds of bonds they want. And actually there's not that much demand for the really long dated bonds at the moment. Like the market's very much moving towards the short dated bonds. And the interesting thing with the short dated bonds is that they tend to be much closer to the base rate of interest. So like you get a 3-month bond for maybe 3.8%, base rate's 3.75%. Whereas something like a 10-year or a 30-year, that's getting up to 4.5%, 5%, right? And so the government's paying a lot more on the bonds that it's put out there. So this really compelling thing about the TAP system is this is how we used to do it. And what that would mean is that we are not going to be affected by any of the shenanigans in the market, what the bond markets have decided. Now, that might still happen, and currently under the existing system, that does do things like affect mortgage prices and all that kind of stuff. So having things like a public bank would mean that we could protect consumers from that, right? We don't have to follow the whims of the public bank on those yields. I mean, so your mortgage could still be fixed. Maybe we could even provide a 30-year fixed mortgage, and they do that in the Netherlands and the US, so that you're not worried every time you get to the end of your 2-year fix or your 5-year fix, that whatever happens in the latest mini budget is going to affect your mortgage prices. So this is all kind of background on how we can change the system. Did you want to jump in there with any questions before I go on to the actual Liz Truss situation and explain what happened there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you're working through my questions without me prompting at the minute. So my next one was what's the TAP system? And then was how do you propose to manage banks, which you've just started getting into. So I think we're covering them.
Okay, great. So yeah. So I'll address the Liz Truss question. What was interesting about that situation is that it happened due to a very specific condition that was present in the economy. So it was 2022. The Bank of England was actually already unwinding quantitative easing. So they were selling the bonds back into the market that they had purchased back in the financial crisis. And what that means is that you're kind of oversupplying bonds to the market. And so, that's making prices go up, right? So that's actually making the interest rates go up already, the yields. So they were already causing this sort of increase. And there were some issues being flagged at the time because pension funds were in this situation where they if the interest rates went up above a certain amount, they were going to be forced to have to offload a bunch of their investments to prove that they could kind of like meet their overall sort of like basically make sure that the pension funds that they were liable for putting out, that they actually had the capital to stand behind that. So the interest rates going up was already causing this sort of like, issue with pension funds having to sell off. So when the mini budget hit and people saw that, that there was this like big tax cut. Yes, okay, there was a bit of a panic. And to be clear, I think her policies were absolutely terrible. Like I would never, advocate doing what she did. But I want to make it super clear that it wasn't because of the unbalanced budget that everything crashed. The reason it crashed was because, yes, there was this trigger. Banks are worried that her policies are going to create inflation, and so they're worried that their bonds that they hold are going to be less valuable. So they also start selling their bonds off into the market. And because the interest rate keeps going up, we get into like a doom loop with the pension funds, where again they're now forced to sell off more bonds, and it basically just created this loop of instability that the Bank of England already knew about. Now, again, I think Liz Truss should have spoken to the Bank of England, warned them what she was doing, and also held them to account for the thing that they were doing with the pension funds, which has now actually been addressed. So we wouldn't see that same kind of feedback loop. It should, were we to do something like this. The other really key thing that I want everyone to know is 5 days into the Liz Truss crisis, the Bank of England came out and said, okay, part of their mandate is to stabilize, the economy. And so they said, we will put aside 90 billion to buy back bonds at the market price. So, basically what that says is that it puts like a huge, sigh of relief out to all these people but the only reason that they're like actually selling their bonds is because they're worried that they can't get the face value or close to the face value back for it. If they know that there's a buyer in the Bank of England who has the deepest pockets in the entire economy, they don't need to sell anymore. And that was evidenced by the fact that the Bank of England, I think, only actually ended up spending 16 billion of that 90 billion that it promised. So that just shows that, if you're working in tandem with the Bank of England, they also can stabilize the bond markets. So I think the two things to just be really clear is that, the unstable bond markets are a choice. And then the being able to decouple the cost of government borrowing on new spending from what's happening in the bond markets. Both of these things are very possible.
What are the proposals in the policy for banking generally?
There is a big focus on, regional banking, making sure that people are able to access credit in and different forms of businesses, so cooperatives, and I think a big part of this is the credit controls. So making sure that we where we talked before about how all this money that gets created out there, it's not just the government that creates it, it's also banks. We need to make sure that the types of things that we don't actually want to happen in the economy that are either violating human rights abuses or creating human rights abuses, sorry, or allowing just fossil fuels or really bad unnecessary production to happen. We can put credit regulation on that to stop it from happening, and that frees up the resources for us to then be able to use them in public projects. So yeah, and I think the public bank, that sort of just provides the floor at which all other banks would sort of have to offer comparable service. I think that will really help in terms of making sure that people get the best value for their money and their savings.
Great. So I just want to kind of sum up because we covered quite a lot of ground. So it's fiscal referees, tap system, and regional banks, publicly run and owned banks, and banking regulation. Those are the kind of main pillars of the policy.
Yeah, and it's smaller than the motion that we brought to conference in October 2025. I think the feedback there was, it's just such a huge change to change an entire chapter. But this is basically the macroeconomic policy switch out. Our policy has not been updated for I think more than 15 years at this point. We are really proud to bring this as a new platform for how we can then think about how we deliver the kind of economic system change that we need.
Great. So what's the kind of overall vision for the economy? What are you kind of hoping for the outcome to be?
So I think this again goes back to the donut economics view, right? I think putting this together really is supposed to be a framework, so that the whole party can think about what's possible in all our different policy areas, and really trying to reframe everyone towards thinking about, okay, what are the real resources we have to play with, and not the money, because the money can be found. This, I mean, you can think of a real world example of where this happened, right? Like the Tories announced that childcare provision, right, where they, everyone was going to get a bunch of extra hours, and then in the real world, those places just don't exist, and so like, you cannot announce policies like that. It's not just a case of money; it's a case of like where are the real resources coming from? So we're hoping that this will encourage the whole party to think in this way. So going back to the vision for the economy, everyone's material needs should be met within planetary boundaries. Okay, so like in terms of like the specifics, like the economy policy working group is obviously not the entire of the policy for a sustainable society document, but in terms of the ideas that we have for the rest of the chapter, universal basic services will be an absolutely key part of this. We need to decommodify everything that we actually need to live good lives. So housing, truly funded healthcare service, transport, education, energy. As part of that, like a massive public investment in renewable energy. I think so much of the frustration with the move towards net zero is like not seeing the kind of touted benefit of this cheaper energy that we were told we were going to have, because all of the policy costs are put onto people's bills. And then we have like trickery, like I don't know if the viewers are familiar with contract for difference, but basically that's what we have to do to bribe private developers to actually build renewable energy, because it is just so cheap. Like, wind and sun don't need like fuel, they don't need coal, they don't need uranium to run. And so, you can't make a lot of profit from these renewable energies. And so, we basically guarantee a price to these developers, which ends up being much higher than it would actually be if we just built the renewables ourselves and then just let the cheap prices go directly to the public, because we don't need to make a profit on it. So that's one area. A national care service would be really, really key as part of this. So making sure that we kind of take the care system out of private hands, which is just so, there's been a ton of reports recently about how much wealth extraction goes into the pockets of private individuals from the care service, making sure that people's conditions, their material conditions when they work in this sector, are just so much better, and that they're doing some of the most important work in our economy, and making sure that they're rewarded as such. A really key part of this is what I've touched on before around the food and energy sovereignty. So really, like, the crisis that is unfolding around us with, we obviously, like in London, I think we've had maybe like a micro speck of rain in the whole of July. And so, thinking about how we're going to build resilience up against that. We have like privatized water companies who've done nothing to make sure that we reduce the amount of leakage of water, which is just enormous. No new reservoirs built. Like, we are just so unprepared to face this crisis. And so investment in these areas would be absolutely critical. And in the agroecological solutions to reduce dependence on fossil fuel-based fertilizers, like we spoke before. Massive investment in good jobs in our public services and in local government, things like nature, and then on top of that, things like nature restoration, retrofitting. We're missing so many jobs in our public services, and those need to be addressed. And then even under basic income, like there is still a basic income of about, I think the 2019 proposal for basic income was about £4,000 a year. So it's it's a kind of like a subsistence level. People need to work above that, right? Or they're going to want to find meaningful work above that. And so making sure that anyone who wants to find a job can get one. I think that would be an area that would be really compatible here. But I think what's really key here is this is not compatible with capitalism. I think this is very much like an eco-socialist framework. I think you start to get into these recognitions that under this system, you're not going to have kind of the reserve army of labor, this sort of precarious group of people who will just take any job that they want, because there's going to be so much well-funded work in areas that are actually really important. I really think we should lean into this. I think this is an eco-socialist vision. It's revolutionary, and I think this framework really shows how we can get there.
Great. I think that's sort of hinted at the answer to my next question, which is, if we can do all these things, why aren't all governments doing these things? Is it because they haven't got a clue what they're doing, or is it because they have some sort of motive other than providing these things?
Yeah, no, I think we're very much on the same page here. I think there are some people who think that there's this kind of willful or learned helplessness or just ignorance about how the system works. And I think it's possible that some people operating at an actual level, like a policy level, maybe are that way, but I think they've been put there by people who really want the system to stay how it is. I think the idea is that if we make things precarious, then people will just take whatever job they have to, and then that's how we we still get the economic growth we need through, well, we don't really get the economic growth, but there's things like the gig economy thriving, and like these, it's just like not thinking about people, it's thinking about like how that next bit of growth gets eked out. I think I think the real challenge is I mean, it is political will. We need to find people who will do this, but there will be a lot of sabotage, I think, and I think a big part of this is making sure that as many people on the ground are aware of how these things work, aware of what's possible, because that's when you start to not fall for the wool being pulled over your eyes about there not being any alternative. About I think I've always been really like inspired by the Don't Pay UK campaign a few years ago, but I think a lot of people will say that is what one of the inputs into the energy price guarantee. When you have like hundreds of thousands of people saying that they're not going to pay their energy bills, and the energy providers going to the government and saying, look, we are going to be really screwed if like not everyone, if this many people don't pay their bills, you need to do something. I think if we educate enough people in this to understand how the system works and what could be different, I think that's really crucial. And I don't want to end this bite without sort of mentioning, acknowledging the fact that this is something that applies to us because we're a global north economy, and we've exploited so many other countries in the world to be in this state. I think this framework, though, is also really compelling for countries in the global south, and I draw on a lot of the work of Fadel Kaboub and Ndongo Sambasila on this. The idea being that if you focus on those things that I've touched on, so things like food and energy sovereignty, so building up, like a part of this as well is obviously like getting out of the situation where as global north countries we need to work to cancel debt, and I know that a lot of work has been done on that from like a public perspective in the past, but now a lot of these countries are indebted to private companies, and then a lot of those laws are made in London and New York, and so you get situations where global south countries are forced to pay huge proportions of their GDP to service loans that they can't even go bankrupt on because of the laws protecting them in London and New York. And so that's something we absolutely have to address. And so if you can then build up your economy for food and energy sovereignty, so you make sure that rather than, if you're a country in, let's say, Africa that's like growing flowers or tomatoes for a global north market, you can instead focus on growing actual wheat that you've previously had to import. You could, like I think Angola and Nigeria and other countries like that, they export huge amounts of crude oil and don't have the ability to refine that locally. So a big part of this is technology transfer and like global equitability in terms of like making sure that IP is shared so that that technology capacity can be built domestically. I think like we have to stop believing that capitalism is what lifts all countries out, because literally capitalism can only exist if there is this set of oppressed countries. And I think having a framework like this which shows how you could build an economy that is in itself resilient, I think is really compelling, and I didn't want to end the interview without calling that out.
So what you're saying effectively is that the what we can do in the economy isn't governed by bits of paper or kind of units of exchange. It's governed by the actual resources and the actual people we have available to us, and how we use those bits of paper can be determine how we do these things.
Yeah, so that's exactly the message we want people to take away. So it's not the money, it's the people, the skills, the actual materials that we need to build the things we want to do. So like the steel that we want to make, and land. And some of that is going to come from imports. We're not saying that we're a closed economy. We do need to trade for other countries for some of the things we need, but we're also a very developed economy. We have things that other people want. And so like, part of this strategy will be making sure that people will continue to want some of the things that we make. And so that will balance our ability to take imports with the exports we have to offer the world. We have a lot of potential to build the economy we want to see with public money, and it means we can actually have real conversations about what the priorities are. So all the things we've discussed before, do we actually have enough people to do that? Do we actually have enough of a carbon budget to do that? I'm not saying that these are, this doesn't fix everything. It's not an easy solution. It just highlights the real conversations that we need to be having to make that happen. And I think that one like final call to action I really want to put out there is, I know this is all really new and like a big way of thinking. And I think, we're going to need to really make sure that we all educate each other if this is something that conference wants to support. I am available, like my colleagues are available to come and talk at your local parties, whether that's in person or online. Do reach out. It's economy@policy.greenparty.org.uk.
Great. Sheridan, thanks very much.
Thank you.